Thank you. Welcome to the 19th Annual National Book Festival. My name is Colleen Chogan. I'm the Assistant Deputy Librarian at the Library of Congress, but I'm also a mystery author, which is the reason why I'm moderating this panel today. Before we start, I just want to give a quick thank you to all of our donors and sponsors who make this festival possible. And if you haven't already, just another reminder, please silence your cell phone. I'm honored today to speak with thriller writer Brianna Labuskes. A little bit about Brianna. She's an Amazon charts and Washington Post best-selling author of dark psychological thrillers. She lives in Washington, D.C., and she works as a journalist for media organizations that cover the minutiae of Capitol Hill and the White House. Her most recent book is Girls of Glass. So join me in welcoming her to the National Book Festival. So Brianna, you're a policy reporter, you're a political reporter here in Washington, D.C. How did you come to write thrillers?
Thrillers. So I think I love writing in the thriller genre just because the reason why people love reading in the thriller genre. When I'm writing that first draft, I'm kind of telling the story to myself. I kind of know where the big bad is, of course, and the twists. But along the way, there's so many, twists and turns that kind of excite me. And so I sometimes will sit down and just be like, oh, can't wait to see what happens. And then I'm like, oh, I have to decide what happens, which is a little less fun part. So I think that really always drew me. And then just kind of like politics, the stakes are so high in thrillers. It's you are playing in this, landscape of like just really, really extreme emotions and kind of like what makes us human at our core. So you have like panic and you have terror and you have hope and survival. And I think that, like a lot of writers, I kind of understand the world through writing. And so being able to kind of dig into all of those kinds of emotions is really challenging and exciting for me. So.
Now, a lot of women write mysteries and write crime fiction, but fewer women actually write thrillers. Why do you think this is?
I think anytime that you have women creating art, you're going to have it touched by gender expectations. And I think that thrillers in particular kind of are, have more gruesome language and like what is acceptable for a woman to write. And I think that, that was decades ago, of course. And you have kind of an acceptable language and murder that women can create. But I do think that like in the last 5 or 6 years, you're kind of starting to see a little bit of a shift of like women really busting into this psychological drama. And I think that came when it kind of switched, the genre itself like kind of switched from like that like Da Vinci Code, political, global spy instead. And what you're seeing that's popular these days is more like the psychological, intimate partner violence, husband and wife relationships are so huge. You see so many books that feature that. And I think women really recognized, okay, like this is the violence that I experience in my life, and these are my stories that I want to tell, and it started to resonate more, and so you're seeing kind of a little bit of that gender shift into the genre. But what I find interesting is that men now are adopting gender ambiguous names to kind of find success within the thriller genre.
Like the initials.
The initials,
yeah,
exactly. Or like Riley, and it's not like, deceptive or anything, but it's, I think that's really cool. Like that's a cool sign that like maybe we're starting to see a shift where you're chasing success is chasing a female writer.
Okay. Do you have any role models in the genre? And if so, how did they influence you?
Yeah, I just think there's so many talented ladies out there killing it in the genre. And, like Tana French, Dan Harper. I just very distinctly remember Lisa Gardner being one of my first mystery, exposures to mystery and thrillers. And I was like, what is this? This is so cool. But for me as a writer, I think two stand out, and one is Megan Abbott, and I actually discovered her at this festival a couple of years ago. And I just thought she was so poised and wonderful, so I read all of her books. But she writes not necessarily like page turners, like you want to flip through them, but they lean heavily on the psychological aspect. Plus, her writing is just gorgeous. And then she writes really complex relationships between her female characters. Like her last novel was about PMS and like violent rage that is induced by PMS. And like, is that an excuse for murder? And so she had relationships between like these female scientists who have to be cutthroat in their genre or in their field, because there's not that much money in academia. So I think that she's really inspirational in how she approaches that. And then I think it's like a little bit cliche, but Gillian Flynn with Gone Girl, I think she really was the one who yanked me into wanting to write the genre, like not just wanting to read the genre. She has this, she's a beautiful writer, of course, but she has this beautiful, like this cool way of making these terrible characters that you have no interest in rooting for, engaging, like compelling. You want to read the book even though they're kind of really unlikable. And they're women, and you're only allowed to be unlikable in a certain way if you're a female character, or else you'll hear it in reviews and stuff like that. And I think that she kind of just shrugged that off. And in an industry that, success chases success, everyone wanted to replicate it, and so she just kind of busted open this door of, more complexity within female characters, and I really appreciate that. So she's always kind of a top lady for me.
Now, you consider yourself a feminist, but a lot of your books contain violence against women.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that?
It's hard. It's definitely something that I think about a lot. I think being aware of the fact that when done poorly, this genre can lend itself to toxicity. I think you can see it when it's done not well, is that you have a female victim and she just becomes essentially a receptacle to male violence. And then the story becomes about, like the detective and his fedora and the serial killer, the really smart serial killer, and the story is about them. And she becomes a name on the page and a plot point to move the story forward. And I think that when that happens, like you see it in action movies too, like with, desire instead of violence. You don't have any complexity to that character. And so I think that is really dangerous. I think what you're seeing these days, especially with all these women who are kind of coming into the genre, I think, yes, the victim is female, but so is the detective, and so is the bad guy, and so are the bystanders. And so instead of, her pain serving as a plot point, it serves as these women who are operating in a violent world. And they save themselves, they're saving others. They have character stories that are beyond she died. And these are the gruesome ways that she died. And so I think that when you have those intricacies built in, you're still telling the story of violence against women, but we exist in a world that has violence against women, and to pretend that that isn't our reality is almost cheapening it. I don't know, every woman I know knows 5 to 10 survival tips that are kind of crazy, of just existing in the world. And so, and you see all of these, like I mentioned earlier, the husband and wife psychological thrillers are huge these days, but that is the violence that is being perpetrated upon women. And it's look at the statistics is crazy. So we're telling the stories, and women are existing in these violent worlds, but if you're aware and you kind of think through each scene that you're creating, each character that you're creating, why is this a woman victim? Why is this a female victim? Why is this a male serial killer? It can serve a purpose. It can still exist, but you want to have a reason behind it and make sure that what you're doing isn't gruesome and or gruesome for no reason. It's still, you want to get that evil on the page, but there should be a reason behind it. And so I think just kind of like in general, like being aware of what you're writing and where your blind spots are, and the fact that we all have inherently, we were raised in this, society of harm that exists, and you might, slip and write it into it and stuff.
So your first book, It Ends With Her, is really scary. It's terrifying. I read it actually when I was on a work trip, and I was in a hotel room by myself, and I was really scared. It was hard for me to go to sleep at night. But so it worked. If that was the goal, it worked. It's about a serial killer. So can you tell us how you learned about the psychology of serial killers, which was part of the book?
Yeah, I've just been always really interested in psychology in general. I was thinking about, majoring in psychology in college. So I've always just been attracted to why we do things, why we interact with different people, all sorts of stuff. And so I kind of had like a little bit of a layer of that. And I feel like once you kind of dig into that field, you kind of, abnormal psychology becomes like the next step. Because we are such social creatures, and like if we have someone who's existing outside the norm of like our social rules, we're just like fascinated by it. And so I think that that's part of the draw. I think research-wise, so I have that layer, whatever, but we're like living in this like golden age of true crime stories.
True.
Like you could, do Russian roulette on your podcast and, never end up re-listening to a true crime or psychological thriller. So I think just exposure and like consuming media and everything like that, I think that kind of lends itself to building this knowledge base. Great.
Your latest book is Girls of Glass, and it is a very dark premise for the book. Can you talk a little bit about the premise?
Yeah, so it centers around this very powerful family in St. Petersburg, Florida. And the judge has, iron control over his entire household until the granddaughter in this household goes missing and she turns up murdered. And so we have an investigator come in who lost her own child to violence. And so all the evidence kind of is adding up that it's the mother of this child that killed her. But the detective is like, sympathize, and she's kind of getting like this mirror of her own experience. And so she's like, no, I don't think it's her. And so they kind of dig deeper, and they kind of uncover all of these really dark secrets of that family, and the way that they're hidden, and the way that they're presented to the world. And so there's that. I think it is fairly dark, and I have gotten that feedback. But I think that with thrillers, the really cool thing with thrillers is that there does exist this like moral framework of the bad guy's gonna get his in the end, like even at the deepest, darkest point of a thriller, if it's, follows the traditional genre, the justice is going to be served, and the bad guy is going to be stopped, and there's this kind of this satisfaction of when we're living in a world that doesn't necessarily always look like what we experience in reality, and we're all kind of just like very frustrated with like, things not coming around like that. I think even being in a dark situation, I think at the end there's that hope, and I think that's, again, back to that human emotions, those deep human emotions of survival is at the end of thrillers, I think. So I think that's pretty cool.
The other important characteristic of Girls of Glass is it's an almost all-female cast of characters.
Yeah.
There's one man who's at the center of the story, but you hardly really see him or interact with him as a character. How have readers reacted to this all-female perspective?
I thought it was gonna not go over well with some readers, and I'm sure it hasn't. I'm sure there have been some people who have put it down. But I've actually gotten some really good feedback from male readers who will just email me and be like, yeah, you did such an excellent job, and like not even mention anything about like how there isn't male representation. And it's funny because my first draft of the book, I got up on my like angry soapbox or whatever, and I was like, this man has had such a huge influence on all these women's lives. Mm-hmm. I didn't want him to have a voice on the page. I was like, you don't get a voice. And then I turned that draft in to my agent, and she's like, you can't do that. She's like, there's cops involved, they have to interview him, like we need to see it and all sorts of stuff. And I was like, fair. So he does actually get words. It's very small, but I actually ended up really liking the chapter. So it's kind of a lesson where you're like, don't get too attached to like your moral high grounds that you like decide to take. Like you have to make it service the book. And so if it doesn't service the book, then you have to change it. But that was my first draft. He literally had no words.
Another big theme of the book is motherhood.
Yeah.
You're talking about motherhood a lot in this book, and you don't romanticize it in the book. You created these characters, so what did you want to say about motherhood today with those characters?
So motherhood was actually where I started the book. I'm kind of at that age where all of my friends and family are starting to have kids, and you really hear just when you're close enough with them, and you hear like the daily struggles of like, okay, this random person came up to me and told me I shouldn't be eating sushi because I'm breastfeeding, and I'm like, in what world is that like acceptable behavior, social behavior? But it is, because we have this carte blanche on being able to tell like women what to do, and it's such a weird dichotomy because we glorify them. You don't become a woman until you have children. But we also infantilize them, and we don't trust them. And they're, you could find just scads of advice out there. Like if you co-sleep with your kid, you're going to kill them. Like if you don't, you're going to scar them psychologically. And so I just found this push and pull such a reflection of how we kind of deal with women in general in our society. So I thought that was really interesting. And so I kind of, again, went into, when you're in a thriller genre, you can take that and you can just like amplify it. And so you're like, okay, well, what happens when this woman like loses her kid to violent crime? How does everyone react? And how do these women who have both had that experience react to each other? So, and then again, one of the children in the books is, a product of abuse. And so how does that, what kind of motherhood does that look like when it's not something you wanted? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In the worst ways.
In both of your books, revenge is a major motive. And I love revenge too when I'm writing. It works. Why do you think crime writers like revenge, and why do they use it so much?
I think part of it is just like really satisfying for readers, where it's like you're like, I want like revenge on all the people who've done me wrong. But I also think that it's harder to kill people than like it kind of seems when you're reading like thrillers and stuff. Like it's actually like it's hard to kill someone to get yourself to do it. And I think you only have so many motives, and so revenge is such a powerful one that kind of shuts down the intrinsic don't kill somebody. And I don't think there are that many motives. So I think it becomes like you see it again and again, but I think that people can do it really cool ways because it's, there's so many ways that you need to take revenge on people.
Right. You write your books in an interesting way. You write them from the different characters' perspective, and sometimes the story goes backwards and forwards. And I wanted to know why you have decided to write your books in that fashion, and actually, how do you write them? Do you write them character by character, or do you write them sequentially as they appear in your book?
I think it can be tricky, but as like a writer, I just find it more interesting, where I'm like jumping heads, and I just want to kind of delve into other characters' heads. I also really am intrigued by the idea of like the perceived self versus what you see. And so I really like when you have two different characters interacting and the reader gets to see kind of like it from the other side. Like one of my characters, Charlotte, to the world, she's like very composed, and but inside her head, she's like a mess, like an absolute mess. She's melting down. So anyways, to be able to get to see her from both sides, like the inside and the outside, I think that's really cool. Writing it is, I have two timelines in my head, essentially, and the timeline of the book. So it's like the action that's happening. But then there's the timeline that the reader is reading. And I think that one's actually more important because each chapter you need to reveal something. Like each chapter has to serve a purpose. So what that timeline looks like is actually more important than this like, January 2nd, January 3rd at 10 o'clock or whatever. It's more like, okay, what did the reader learn in this chapter? What did he learn in that chapter? What did they learn in that chapter? And so I kind of keep this more important than the top one, and then just kind of go back and fix any little boo-boos.
That's complex. So you must have to plot everything out so you know where you're going.
So I am kind of a pantser.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing, writing the way you write. Yeah.
I kind of am I'm telling myself the story when I'm writing. So in the way that the reader would read it, and the first draft does not, believe me, does not look like the end product. It's usually like 20,000 words shorter. Everything gets moved. I have no compunction like just ripping chapters apart or like moving them because I'm an editor, so it's just like whatever, get rid of it. Or move it or like whatever. And so that needs to happen, but like that core bones of the story, I just sit down and like usually write. I know like there are plot points that I need to hit, and I know the end. And I love getting to the end because then you're just like, ooh, what's that gonna happen? But I don't know kind of like how I'm gonna get there always. Yeah.
In your books, you have a heavy involvement of law enforcement or the FBI.
Yeah.
And how did you learn about law enforcement procedure? How did you, include that in your books? Because it's very true to life.
Thank you. Again, it's kind of the consumption of just popular culture. I think I always, again, with that like first draft, I'm not always hitting all of the beats, the procedural beats, and that's something like my first readers will always be like, okay, but they're cops and they like need to like put gloves on, and I'm like, oh right, okay, they can't just like talk to each other about morality. So I do kind of have to consciously make the decision to go through. That is one of my like edits, my edit throughs. But yeah, I also found this really cool thing. I haven't gone to it yet, but there is a summer camp for like writers, and you get to like walk through like blood splatter and like fake crime scenes with like detectives. I didn't realize this existed, and I'm like very excited to try it and like be a criminal. So I definitely want to do more of it, but I do think we kind of like get this boost of being in this like just oversaturated era of like true crime.
It's true.
Yeah.
Now, I hope I'm not giving anything away, but both of your books end with, surprise endings.
Yeah.
And they're big reveals. How do you plan, your bait and switch? And is this your hallmark as a thriller writer, is these surprise endings?
I hope so. I want them to be. I think that when I was writing It Ends With Her, I wasn't sure if people would guess the ending or not. And about, like have to, probably less than that. But I wanted it to just feel like, like a satisfaction more necessarily than like where did that come from? So I think that I don't necessarily want to be like the surprise twist person, but I want it to be like, oh, that makes sense. And it surprised me in a way that I wasn't expecting. And I do like that. I like when things all kind of click together. I think writing a twist is the hardest thing I have to do. Like, it's literally hands down hardest thing about being a thriller writer, I think, because thriller readers are like so sharp, and like they've seen it all, and they will call you on your BS, and they can predict it so well, but they're also really welcoming. They want to give you a try, like they want to be surprised, and they want to have that moment, and so I think they keep you on your toes, and I think hopefully I'll keep trying to have these twists.
Perfect. Can you tell us, you have another book coming out soon?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Black Rock Bay, so that comes out at the end of October, and it was, I came up with it because I was looking at these like islands on Maine, that off the coast of Maine that have like 200 people on them, and the post office is like this little tiny thing. And I thought, like, what a great place. It's all about like survival, and it's set in the winter. And I had already kind of latched onto the idea of writing about isolation and depression. And so what happens is we have the main character, Mia, and she grew up on this island, and then she ran away from it because she had a traumatic experience happen when she was 15. And then a journalist dies, and she kind of gets called back to investigate it because no one else will talk, like these people will not talk to anybody else other than someone who grew up on the island. And so as she's researching it, as she's kind of investigating, she realizes that it's probably tied. He was looking into the trauma that happened to her, the violence that happened to her. And so it kind of all gets tied together. And it's just like really a kind of an exploration of memory a little bit, of how, you know, we think memory is so, it's a video camera and that's like what happened, or memory is super fluid, and it can change and it can be altered, and like if you have someone manipulating it, then it'll extra get changed. So that's kind of the...
Terrific. I can invite questions from the audience now if anybody has a question to ask Brianna about her writing, about the thriller genre. I'll take another stab while we have people starting to line up. So you're a reporter in DC, as we talked about, but you write these novels. How do you manage
the time?
Yes, the time, and how do you balance, you know, your day job with, which is becoming really a second career?
Right. Yeah, it's definitely difficult. I think it's writing for me is one of those, like, I don't have an excuse. I have to do it. So I do 2 hours I write it 2 hours every day for the weekdays, and then on weekends I usually will do like full days of writing sometimes. I think it's just that, you know, you have to want it. It is definitely a sacrifice, that you have to make decisions of giving other things up. But I think that one thing is I do work early in the morning, so I get off. So I have like big chunks of time where I can really devote to concentrating on it. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
We have a question over here.
My question is actually for the both of you.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think there are genres of thrillers that audiences are less willing to accept female authors, like military or techno thriller or espionage, things like that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that, and I think that's kind of why you didn't see it, you know, why, if you Google like top thriller writers, it's just all dudes, like at the top, like the image results, except for like 1 or 2. And so I think that's because a lot of them were, you know, like that. So it's like the Da Vinci Code, the spy thrillers. I couldn't predict if the like readers wouldn't pick a woman up. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know about that. Political thrillers, you don't see too many women writing those. When you'd imagine
don't.
they would.
But it's interesting because politics is so, like, it's power dynamics, it's psychological, it's, you know, a lot of things that you can excel at anyways with thrillers.
Question.
Hi.
So, you know, one feature of mysteries and thrillers is often a twist in the end, or a resolution, if you will. I was wondering if there's any, and you mentioned several of your authors that inspired you. Are there any books that you like to read again, even though you might know the ending, that you just want to read it and experience it again?
Yeah, because like, and you also kind of want to see if you missed any clues or like where all that stuff is. Oh my gosh, so many. I have no problem, I have no compunction about reading books like just 10, 12 times. I think I've read my favorite books like, you know, countless amounts. I think I think books can kind of become like a representation of an emotion that you had during that time when you were reading it, and sometimes you want to chase that emotion, and sometimes you want to experience it as, you know, 5 years, like I'm a different person than I was 5 years ago, so let me read my favorite book again and see like what I can pick up. I think with thrillers, you know, the whole surprise thing is all the rage. You want the big surprise, you want the big twist. And so it's kind of like, how do you justify reading it again if you already know the ending? But the journey is such an experience. The journey is so fun, and like being able to pick out like the little clues is really cool.
Tell us a little bit about your publishing story. This is always a good question to ask writers. So, you know, you're a reporter, but at some point in time you wanted to write in the mystery thriller genre, and you had to go through the process to actually find an agent, find a publisher.
Yeah.
And tell us about that. How did you go about that? How long did it take you? Was it a difficult process?
Yeah, so I've always just been interested in writing in general. I've always wanted to, and I actually grew up reading romance novels.
Oh.
So it was kind of like my.
Wow.
It's my,
So romance to
romance to
That's a
thriller.
big leap.
Yeah. But you know, romance has like the character development that you really see layered into thrillers these days, which I think is really cool. But yeah, I started reading romances, and so I was always like, well, why don't I just try? And so I did some research, which is my biggest suggestion for anyone who wants to start into the industry is research. And you kind of look at what sells and like what's happening or whatever. So I wrote a historical romance, and I submitted it to the publishers that I had researched beforehand, and it got picked up. And so I was kind of going down that path, and I wrote another one that hasn't seen the light of day because I didn't feel like editing it. And
that's very frequent. People don't know that.
Yeah.
The authors write a lot of books that don't actually get picked up or published. And
Yeah.
that's very common.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of hurts a little bit to be like, okay, 80K just scrapped right there. 80K words, just gone. But at the same time, it's like writing is never a waste, I don't think. You're always, no matter what you're writing, you're practicing. So, you know, even though that book wasn't published, it was, you know, it helps me grow as a writer. But then I have some friends who we do like a little bit of a writing group just to get us writing every month. And it was my turn to bring a prompt, and I didn't have a prompt. And we met in this diner, and there was this photo on the wall. And I was like, well, why don't we just write a prompt off of this photo? It's kind of cool. It was like a broken down shop, like it was like torn up and stuff. And so that actually became like the first chapter of It Ends With Her, because I just really liked the character. And I was like, well, let me just see, like she's chasing a serial killer, let's just see what happens. And that chapter's actually lived through lots of edits and made it into the final version. And so it was kind of an accident that I kind of stumbled into thrillers. I really liked reading them, and I really wanted to explore them, but I, you know, that hadn't been my trajectory. And then I kind of stumbled into it. And then, so I didn't have an agent for my romance, but I kind of thought you needed one for like a thriller. It's more of like a harder genre to publish in. So I was researching just agents that there's like tons of information out there. Like you can just find like so much information. Agents want to have books submitted to them. So they put out wish lists and all sorts of stuff. So I found one who kind of matched what I was looking for. She, you know, one of her requirements was like, no dude-driven apocalyptic novels, and I was like, you're my kind of lady. And we just kind of, I was actually she was moving into a smaller agency. I was one of her first clients that she signed. And then we just kind of did the submission process, and the whole thing actually went pretty fast, about a year, I think, from when I went looking for her. So I think I was lucky. I hit like every time, like each part of the stage of the process, I got lucky and I hit like the right person at the right time. And I think that's so much what publishing is
correct.
Hitting the right person at the right time and getting the person in the room to say yes.
The other thing you mentioned, you talked about you have a writing group that you work with. So talk a little bit about the importance of these groups and also just the general writing community of authors.
Oh my gosh, I love the writing community. I think it's like, looking outside, from the outside, you could think oh, everyone's competing against each other. We're all, competing for sales or whatever. But I've never had that experience. It's always been very supportive. We were talking about, Sisters in Crime,
Yes,
and
right.
like you have all sorts of communities like that exist. And I went to one conference in March and met these people for the first time, and they're inviting me to they're putting me in their newsletters and like all sorts of stuff. And it's just, I think there's kind of an idea that we like all rise, we all kind of rise with the tides, and supporting reading and supporting the thriller community in general, is kind of where you want to go. I think for like writing groups and things like that, I think it's so integral to get feedback on your writing, because you can only get so far with your own eyes and your own perspective on something. And you need someone else to come in and be like, yes. But that's a really vulnerable experience to share your writing with someone else, right? Like,
Yeah.
It feels like you're getting shoved out onto a stage, naked, and being like, hey, tell me what you think. And so I think that having people in the community who can be like, okay, like I loved this part, but like this is what you need to work on, and do it in a really loving and like safe way when you're first starting out and you're first, have your first readers. Like I always have my friends read my first draft of my books, because I want to be like, you're a reader, but you're also going to be like, not, destroy my soul.
So here, last question. What kind of reaction do you get when, because you're working as a reporter in Washington, D.C., but you also write these novels. So what kind of reaction do you get from the Washington community when you meet people, when you're out and about, and you say, yeah, I'm a reporter, but by the way, I also, basically I kill people for fun in books. What kind of, people find this very, very odd. When
Do they?
Yeah, when I tell people this, I mean, it's not say it's in a bad sell, but it's something that people find very unusual, and it's not the common thing that you see necessarily in Washington, D.C.
Yeah,
so
for real.
I'm just kind of curious. What
People are like, why aren't you writing a political
Yes,
thriller?
right,
And I'm
right.
like, because my brain will explode.
Because truth is sometimes not stranger than fiction.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, I don't think my mental defenses would like handle being immersed in it all the time. I actually, the most common reaction I get in DC is, I've always wanted to write a book.
Oh, okay. So there's a lot of people that then.
Yeah, it's always
that's
like a lot
very
of the
interesting.
projecting. But I do have people come up to me. Like I've had a couple people in my life come up to me and be like, are you okay? Like,
Because what you're writing is really dark.
yeah, and they're like, do you need to talk about anything? And I think I've had some people, there's a self-harm scene in It Ends With Her, and apparently written pretty well in terms of like people, like I've had multiple people be like, did you? And I'm like, no, I just am really into psychology. So like, so I've read a lot about that experience of, what you do when you self-harm. So so I have had people do that, or like, what was your childhood like? And I'm like, no, it's okay. So that's kind of like the most common reactions I get.
Okay, last question. If you had 3 words to describe your writing or your books, what 3 words would you use to describe it?
Ooh.
So this is good. This is you being able, because I've read your reviews, and that's other people interpreting your books.
Yeah.
But how would you describe to a group of potential readers and readers out there, how would you describe your writing in your books?
Oh, I want to say kind of creepy, layered, and satisfying.
Terrific, good. Well, everybody join me in thanking Brianna